My name's Dean. I'm a person in long-term recovery. And what that means to me is I haven't had a drink or drug since July 7th of 2007. And as a direct result of that, I've been able to become a productive member of society, a dad to a beautiful little boy, become employable, I stopped going to jail, and I host this show, Inside Addiction. My guest today is Roman. Roman, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks.
So, Roman, tell me how it was growing up for you.
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the 70s and the 80s. I don't know, my household was, it was, my dad wasn't around a lot, but what I do remember was that when he was around, there was a lot of insanity and fighting between him and my mother. I'm a middle child of three. I have an older sister and a younger sister. My dad left when I was around 6 years old. And, well, let me just say this, like, my mom and dad are Latin, and that just says a lot, I mean, as far as, like, my dad was, like, very much his Mo, and what do you call it, like the Latin household, like it was like, what stays in the house, what happens in the house stays in the house.
So that was a culture that you grew up in?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So my dad left when I was about 6 years old, and my mother had to go to work to support us three kids, and my older sister took care of the household, and I sort of like hung out and ran the streets, would you say? I started hanging out at a pretty young age. I could say that I never really felt comfortable in my own skin, and I realized at a young age also that I was gay, and I had a lot of insecurities about that, and I really struggled with that for a really long time. And so, I started hanging out in the park with the older guys, and like, I was a young guy that was like hanging out in the park, and they were like, "Oh, here, give him some beer and stuff," and and weed, what I mean? So I believe I picked up, first time I used was around like 8 years old.
So just a couple years after your dad kind of walked out.
Correct. Yes.
So were you going to school? How was school when you were growing up?
Well, I was in Catholic school from first to the 8th grade, and I never really, like, I did good in school, but I never really liked school. I definitely have a little ADD, and so I struggled with focusing, and I had a lot of my own insecurities, what I mean, and I just never really enjoyed school.
How were your grades?
My grades were okay, like I did okay. I wasn't a student, but I wasn't I wasn't flunking out either,
Right. Did you have friends in school, or you kind of just gravitated towards the older kids that were hanging in the park?
I gravitated more towards the older guys in the park, and and I graduated 8th grade by the time I was like 13, so by that time I had been using like on a regular basis pretty much.
So you started drinking and smoking weed at what age?
8.
At 8 years old.
8, yeah.
With the guys in the park?
Correct.
And from 8 to 13, how did that go?
Well, I mean, I started hanging out with a group of kids in the park and hanging out, and it escalated from like drinking to weed, and then that was a daily based thing, and then I was doing other substances, come into play. I was doing mescaline. And
at what age were you doing mescaline?
Probably like 10.
Wow.
10, 11, and then, I started doing cocaine. I was hanging out with a lot older crowd than me, and I also ran the streets and did graffiti. I thought it was cool.
So you're an artist?
In a way, yeah, in a way.
You could say that.
Yeah, I definitely.
So you started drinking and smoking weed at 8 years old?
Yeah.
And you were doing
cigarettes. Yeah.
And you were doing coke at what age?
I believe I started doing cocaine probably around 12, 13.
Were you introduced to all these different drugs and the progression by the same guys in the park?
No, by that time I had been hanging out with a group of people that wrote graffiti, and there was a couple that what they call were older, a friend of mine, and him and his wife. They were married, and you know, me and my friends would hang out there with them, and we hung out, wrote graffiti, ran the streets, and like hung out at their house, and then we started partying. You know what I mean?
Did you keep going to school that whole time?
Went to school up to the 8th grade, and I got into 9th grade. I went to Aviation High School, and in 9th grade, I wasn't really going to school. Like I was just hanging out and like getting high and like just
You were there.
hanging out in the bathroom and in the schoolyard getting high pretty much, and I wasn't going. And by 13, I decided to drop out. That was in the 9th grade, so I dropped out of school.
What'd your mom think of that?
Well, like my mom was working a lot. You
Yeah.
know, she wasn't around a lot. She did try to like, you know, like put some rules in the house. And I mean, I was just pretty wild. You know what I mean? Like I just did what I want. She tried as hard as she could. You know what I mean?
But she had to work and support 3 kids.
Support 3 kids. Correct.
So you started doing coke at, you said, about 13?
Yes.
And did that progress to even more? I mean, because it's a pretty,
Well,
from
yeah,
8
by-
to 13,
by-
drinking and smoking weed, then 13 we're doing coke. Did you get into anything else?
Well, then we were like doing cocaine and then sort of freebasing and stuff, and you know, with that a lot of alcohol also. You know, I wasn't a big drinker at first. I didn't really like to drink, but cocaine would help me to drink more. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean, and go around the clock, and that's what I did. And by that time, I had dropped out of school and started working with my friend Billy, driving on a truck delivering paper goods, you know, like all over the city, and I was so making money. You know, like it was more important for me to make money,
Right.
you know, and also like trying to sell substances on the side, you know, just so I could get high more. You know what I mean?
How was your relationship with your sisters throughout this? You said you have an older sister and a younger sister.
Right.
How were those relationships affected?
I wasn't really close to my sisters
Gotcha.
like back then at all. Like my sister was taking care of the household while my mother was working, and you know, we would watch my little sister here and there. Like mostly my older sister did all that, so she was sort of like the mother figure, and there was just like a lot of fighting, and when I was around, there was a lot of fighting. You know what I mean? And
So at 13,
I wasn't home much. I was running the streets quite a bit.
So at 13, you were doing coke. Then you started freebasing it at 13 as
Correct.
well.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So we were all doing that, and that went on for a while, you know. And you know, we talk about the progression. You know, it definitely escalated. So I was a marijuana user, daily marijuana user for sure, and then on weekends it was more about like weekend warrior, doing cocaine,
Yeah.
and like freebasing and doing that kind of stuff. About the age of 17, you know, I have to say, like, I was living sort of a double life. Like, I was hanging out in Brooklyn with my straight friends, and then I started hanging out in Queens and gay bars, and like not really being honest about that. You know what I mean? And by the time I was 17, 18, I was working in a gay bar in Jackson Heights, Queens, and
What were you doing there?
bartending.
Okay.
Bartending.
So a job that's very conducive to staying sober.
Absolutely not.
Only spoken from working in clubs
Absolutely
for
not.
20
Yeah,
years.
you know, and for me it was like, you know, more was better, you know, and that's
Yeah.
what I did. You know what I mean? So I was sort of living this double life, like going back to Brooklyn and seeing my straight friends, not really being honest, and you know, and there was a lot of craziness. It was like the 80s, and you know, like New York was a pretty wild place.
So were you kind of torn at that point because you have one set of friends and then a second set of friends, and like you said, almost living a double life? That must have been pretty hard.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and so what I got to say is like a big part of my using was people pleasing. I can say that I didn't really like myself, I believe, you know what I mean? And,
Right from the beginning with the kids in the park.
From the kids in the park, correct. So, you know, for me, using was like, at first, was people pleasing, wanting people to like me.
To fit in.
To fit in, correct. You know what I mean? That was a huge part of my using throughout my life, you know? So I did that for a long time, you know? And so I started bartending. I was making really good money. I was 17, 18, and I was dating somebody that was way older than me, you know, and living like this weird like double life, you know. And there was a lot of drugs and alcohol in that time of my life, you know, and using like a lot of substances, you know, like really like for me it was like whatever could take me outside myself, you know.
Right.
And
Drug of choice is more.
correct.
At that point.
Correct. And that's what it was like for me, you know. And the progression, the escalation was really quickly, you know. So I was working there for a while, and actually the owner of the bar I was dating, sort of.
Oh, that was the person that was older than you.
Right.
So you're 17 dating the owner of the club.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Correct. Right. And so he realized that like I was getting out of control, which seems to be a theme in my life. You know, like when the people that you're partying with tell you that you have a problem, it could be a problem.
I can relate. Like you better
like,
slow down.
Yeah. And I was hanging out with people, and like, so that's what I did. Like I did that, and I got to a point where I wasn't even going back to Brooklyn hardly. Like once in a while I would go back to Brooklyn, but very rarely. I was living in Queens at this point with him most of the time, and like my drug usage was a daily thing, drinking and alcohol and cocaine and whatever I could get, really, pretty much. And I started hanging out with a group of guys there that introduced me to a Colombian drug, and I started smoking that for a while, you know, and things got really, really crazy and hairy, and then it ended me back up in Brooklyn, and but what
Did you go back to Brooklyn to kind of take a break or try to clean up a little bit?
Well, what happened was at that point, you know, like. My drug, like we were pretty out of control, and I was hanging out with these two twin brothers, and they were these hustlers that I knew from Jackson Heights, Queens, and we started ripping off the drug dealers in Jackson Heights. We were doing this drug called Bazooka, and so what we would do is we would call the cops on the drug dealers, and they would throw their bundles underneath the car, and we would grab their bundles and then take off.
That's quite the entrepreneurship.
Right. Until they found and then they found my two friends. They were dead in the schoolyard. Like one had been chopped up, one got thrown off the roof of the schoolyard, and I got like really freaked out, and I went back to Brooklyn. Like I just did, you know what I mean? So
how old was everybody when those two guys basically got
well,
murdered?
they were in their like mid-20s.
Wow.
You know, I was probably like 19 at that point, 18, 19. Yeah.
So that was, I'm guessing, your big wake-up call, and you stopped using and have never used since?
No, not really. So at that point, I went back to Brooklyn, and I tried to clean up my act.
Did you go back with your mom and your sisters, or?
I did for a minute. They, you know, like, I got an apartment in Brooklyn then, and what happened was I went to school for hair while I was living with him because he didn't want me bartending anymore. He was like, you can't, like, you're out of control. So I went to haircutting school and partied throughout that whole time. And so I had got my hair license. So I went back to Brooklyn. I got a job there. I was trying to clean up my act and sort of trying to control using, you know.
That always works well.
It didn't. You know, it was the early 80s and crack cocaine hit the streets, you know, and I couldn't get my substances in Queens anymore. So I went to... In Brooklyn, I started smoking crack, you know, and that took me down really quickly, you know. So I believe, like, in a year's time, I was in that apartment. I remember, like, so back then they had 1-800-COCAINE commercials, you know, and they would list all these like rehabs, and I didn't know anything about recovery or anything. I had hit, you know, like a really bad bottom. Like I remember sitting in my apartment, there was like. What I hadn't sold or gotten stolen, you know, I had this tiny little television. Like I remember sitting on the floor of my room and I had just come off this like insane run. And I was like pretty suicidal. Like I was depressed most of the time. I was using all the time. My family didn't really want to know me, you know, and I had hit a pretty bad bottom, you know what I mean? So I started calling numbers from that list. And so back then there was TCs.
Well, therapeutic community.
Correct. And they were TCs back then.
Sure were.
So I was introduced to recovery sort of in that way at first. I started going to an outreach program, the Brooklyn Outreach Program, down on State Street in Brooklyn. And I would go there twice a week, and I would leave there, and I would go get high, like, you know. And finally my counselor was like, well, this isn't really quite working out for you. And so he says to me, he's like, well, we have this really beautiful facility upstate. You know, it's really nice to have a pool. And so I'm like some kid from Brooklyn, like I didn't have a pool. And I was like, yeah? I was like, all right. And so I came upstate, and I was in a facility called Parksville. It was about 200 something residents. And
Wow, it's a big place.
yeah. And so I could say that like I had hit a bottom that time, and one of my bottoms, I could say. You know, relapse is part of my story.
They kind of have trap doors.
Correct. You know, and so I actually stayed in the program, and most of it was out of fear, and it was out of like wanting to do it for other people, I believe.
Right.
You know, and I never really totally got honest or did any inside work, I believe. You know what I mean? And you know, I graduated after 3 years. I was there for 3 years.
Wow. A residential program?
Correct.
For
Well, I'm
3
talking
years.
about from entry
Yeah.
to re-entry to living outside phase C, which was living out.
Wow.
And then finally graduating was about 3 years. Yeah.
The
I was
days-
I was upstate for 15 months, almost 16 months.
The days of long-term treatment have come and gone, haven't they?
They've changed. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I could say that I definitely got a lot out of it.
Sure.
But
Planted seeds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You know, it definitely taught me a lot about things that I still use today, you know, to tell me stay sober.
Right.
You know, but I had negative reservation of using. You know, I was young, and I didn't think. You know, back then they were actually still giving people drinking privileges in Daytop.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
and it wasn't geared towards 12-step programs or anything like that. And
It's an interesting concept of harm reduction. Stop smoking crack and we'll give you drinking privileges.
correct, right, yeah.
Lots have changed.
Yes. So like I thought I was a drug addict, you know what I mean? I was like I could handle alcohol, you know.
Yeah.
But so like 3 years, literally the day after my graduation, I went out and I relapsed.
Wow, after being in a program for 3 years.
3 years, yes. You know, and so I went out and I got really freaked out. I got scared, and
Yep.
I called up somebody that I knew that was in working 12-step programs that had been sober for quite a while, and I remember calling him and saying, you know, like I went out and relapsed, and so he's like,
So
"Are you done?"
it was a quick turnaround.
Oh, correct. I literally went out for one night.
Wow.
And I was a little freaked out, like really scared, and I knew I didn't want to go back to what I was doing before. So I started going. What do you call it? I started going to meetings and 12-step programs.
And you found a home.
Yeah. So what do you call it? So, you know, like I came into the program, and my life got amazing. Like, you know, you know, you start getting things back. Like life gets good. You know, I could say that I never really fully. What I could say is that I thought that, what do you call it? That I thought a relationship and a house and a good job and a career was going to keep me sober.
Yeah.
You know, and my life
All
got
those,
good.
all those external motivators.
Correct,
If I only
correct.
had this, if I had that.
Correct, absolutely. And so, you know, it worked for a while. Like I was around for a while, and, you know, I would go to meetings here and there. I didn't get honest. I didn't share. I still didn't want you to know me. You know, there was a lot of that fear
Still really
there.
guarded.
Correct.
Not only do you think not only as a person in recovery, but also as a gay man?
Correct.
Made it difficult for you?
Made it difficult, sure, yeah, you know what I mean? But, so I got into, I got into a relationship, and I got an amazing career. I started working, got a great career. I got houses, you know, and, you know.
Houses, plural.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So things turned around.
Oh, absolutely.
Got a great job doing hair.
Absolutely. You know, and then I sort of switched, you know, like I switched one addiction for another. I became sort of a workaholic, you know, and that became more my priority in my relationship, you know, and I was, you know, working all the time. And so I stopped going to meetings and stopped doing the things that I was doing at the beginning, you know,
And what do they say? Anything you put in your recovery?
in front of your recovery. That's right.
Yeah,
You
you
know, I
lose.
learned that the hard way, you know. But I was sort of sober, you know, like abstinent for quite a long time actually, and I was in my relationship for a long time. A few years too many, I would think. You know what I mean? It should have ended before.
Hey, look, people with an addiction sometimes are slow learners.
Right.
In more ways than one.
Correct. And you know, I was like working all the time, you know, and I was pretty miserable. You know what I mean? I was pretty miserable, and I don't know, but you know, my job, you know, became a priority. You know, and so what happened was I stopped going to meetings. I was working all the time. I was in this relationship that I was pretty unhappy with towards the end of it. I mean, we were together for a long time, and it was great for a long time, and then, you know, it stopped being great. And I wasn't going to meetings. I was working all the time. I was traveling for work on weekends. And, you know, like for me, I'm an alcoholic, you know. A lot of I believe that like I relapse before I pick up a drink or a drug, you know, like in my attitudes and things I'm doing. I was sneaking around, I was cheating on my relationships, you know what I mean, being dishonest, and just very unhappy, you know. And for me, like when I'm in a lot of pain and unhappy, you know, using
Go
seems,
back to Old Faithful.
correct, seems like a good idea.
So you relapse.
I did.
Hard?
Well, you know, they talk about the progression.
Yeah.
You know, so I was, I remember like I was sitting at a bar. I was on a business trip on the weekend, and all my coworkers knew I didn't drink. And I ordered a drink, and I had a drink, and my coworkers like, "What are you doing?" Like, I was like, "I got this. Like, I'm good." You know. In a matter of weeks, I was, you know, drinking and sneaking around doing cocaine again. You know, like
back to where you
right
left
back
off.
to where I left off.
So how long was that? Was that a run or kind of a quick turnaround?
No, that was a run. That was a run.
How long did that last for?
That was my last big run there. So from the beginning to the end, it was about close to 5 years almost.
Wow.
You know, and so my job, my boss knew, what do you call it, that I was sort of in recovery, and she found out that I was using. She was not very happy. And she was like, "I think you need to take care of this." And I was like, you know, my ego got in the way, and I was like, "Well, screw you," you know? And I walked away from my job, you know, and I broke up my relationship, you know, because I was drinking and, you know, using. And what happened at that time, I was like traveling every weekend. I couldn't really do cocaine. So I met somebody I was sleeping around with that introduced me to crystal meth. And I thought it was a good idea, you know what I mean? And I could tell you that sort of took me down just as bad as the crack did.
Right.
You know, I sold my house in Brooklyn, broke up my relationship. I decided to come up to my weekend house in Wyndham and to get my life together, to figure things out. And 5 years later, I was right back at that place where I was in Brooklyn years ago. Like alone, suicidal. My family was out of my life, you know. I had been using on a daily basis, and just like wanting to die, you know what I mean? I really believed I was gonna die on that mountain as an addict and alcoholic, you know, so.
So what changed?
I got sick and tired of being sick and tired, you know, like, I remember like I had been trying to figure things out. I had no insurance at the time. And I remember calling a friend of mine, and she was just like, "Get in the car and get yourself." I had been calling detoxes and stuff like that. I had been using every day for 4 years, a lot, you know. And I don't know, I ended up in St. Peter's detox in the emergency room. They put me into detox, and then they got me into an intensive outpatient, you know, and that's where this journey began, you know what I mean? I could say that I had hit a spiritual bottom that I had never hit before, you know what I mean? Like, and it was very different for me. I hadn't lost everything financially, but spiritually I was pretty bankrupt. And and I had to make a decision. Like, I had to realize and get honest with myself that I had never really tried to fully commit myself to this.
Yeah, well, it's half measures availeth nothing.
Correct.
Tell me about Roman in recovery.
I don't know. My life's amazing today. So many gifts. I have my family back now today, which didn't speak to me throughout that whole time. I have some amazing friends in my life. I started doing some inward work. Let's see. I do a lot of service work in recovery, which really helps me a lot. Which is something that I was not willing to do.
We keep it by giving it away.
Correct.
What's the best part of recovery for you?
There's so many good things about recovery.
Right? It's hard to narrow it down.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, honestly, when I came in this last time, I remember I couldn't stop. I was pretty broken and I was a mess, and today I don't have the desire to use, I don't have those chains.
That's a beautiful thing.
It was like a full-time job for me,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And more, So not having the desire to use, the freedom of not having that, is a miracle.
Roman, this is your camera right here. If somebody's watching and is still that sick and suffering person, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, for me, for a long time, I didn't understand that alcoholism and addiction is a disease. I had all that shame behind using and all the things I had done behind that. So if you're using and you're suffering from addiction or anything, that there's hope and there's help. Just reach out. There's a lot of ways to be able to get sober today and get recovery in your life, and just ask for help. For a long time, I think my ego and my pride just kept telling me that I could handle this, and you know what? I could not have done this alone, so if you're struggling with addiction or alcoholism, that there is a solution, that there's hope, and just to go out there and ask for help, Yeah.
Roman, thank you.
Thank you.